uh, which is music on the first Sundays, but I want to welcome everyone. My name is Helen Christians. I'll be your MC this morning. I want to wish you all a happy May Day, which is historically May 1st and was a pagan festival of spring, and in more recent times, International Workers' Day. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching primary importance to human rather than supernatural matters. Humanists believe in the worth and goodness of all human beings. Humanists seek to find common values and respect among people, and humanists seek rational ways to solve human problems in their local communities as well as worldwide issues through science, reason, and free inquiry. It is our tradition to have music on the first Sunday of each month, and so I'm going to welcome back Jeff.
So here's a sprightly song from Ireland. Near Bambridge town in the county Down, one morning last July, down the boreen came a sweet colleen, and she smiled as she passed me by. She looked so sweet from her two bare feet to the crown of her nut brown hair, such a winsome elf that I pinched myself for to see I was really there. From Bantry Bay down to Derry Quay, and from Galway to Dublin town, no maid I've seen like the brown colleen that I met at the county Down. As she onward sped, sure I scratched my head, and I looked with a feeling rare. And I says I to a passer-by, who's the maid with the nut brown hair? He smiled at me, and he says to me, that's the gem of Ireland's crown. Young Rosie McCann from the banks of the Bann, she's the star of the county Down. From Bantry Bay down to Derry Quay, and from Galway to Dublin town, no maid I've seen like the brown colleen that I met at the county Down. At the harvest fair she'll be surely there, so I'll dress in my Sunday clothes, with my shoes shined bright and my hat cocked right for a smile from the nut brown rose. No pipe I'll smoke, no horse I'll yoke, till me plough is a rust-coloured brown, till smiling bright by my own firelight is the star of the county Down. From Bantry Bay down to Derry Quay, and from Galway to Dublin town, no maid I've seen like the brown colleen that I met at the county Down. No maid I've seen like the brown colleen that I met at the county Down. Thank you.
Oh, Jeff, thank you so much. That was wonderful. It was really wonderful. I'd like to now introduce our today's speaker, Katie Murray. She is the Executive Director of Oregonians for Food and Shelter. Katie came to Oregon Food and Shelter after 14 years at Oregon State University working in agriculture extension. Over her career, Katie has worked with producers and consultants, state natural resource agencies, and state and federal legislatures and regulators to bring more focus to the realities and need on the ground and the impacts of regulatory decisions on the natural resources sector. She's also worked to increase shareholder participation in regulatory decision making. After earning a bachelor's degree from the University of Alabama in Huntsville in psychology and philosophy in 2000, Katie completed service in the Peace Corps in Mongolia. She was there from 2003 to 2005. From there, she moved to Oregon and earned a master's degree from Oregon State University in applied anthropology, with a focus on natural resources and communities. Katie's interested in discovering collaborative paths toward what strikes a practical balance between production and protection goals. Katie, welcome. I'm so interested in hearing your program this morning. This is going to be fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation, and hello, everyone. Good morning. I appreciate being able to be here. I have to say, in almost 20 years since coming back from my Peace Corps service in Mongolia, this is the first time I've ever been asked to talk about my experience. So here we go. And, it's been 20 years and I've had 3 kids since then. So that's definitely enough time to have forgotten everything. But I tried to put together something interesting that kind of winds its way back to Oregon. And, thank you to Dr. Dell for insisting that I do this presentation, even though I was a little bit unsure whether it would be good or not. So I'm going to share my screen now and pull this up. And I'll also just say, please feel free to ask questions anytime. If you have questions while I'm talking, totally fine to be interrupted.
Yeah. Katie?
All right, so as you heard, I'm going to talk about natural resource communities from Mongolia to Oregon. I mean, really the only thing these 2 places have in common is me having lived in them both and having been interested in the natural resource sector. So let's see, whoops. Okay, so I'll just give you a little bit of my background. You just heard some of that, and then we'll go into Mongolia and return back to Oregon. So as you heard, I'm the Executive Director of Oregonians for Food and Shelter. I started with this organization in 2020, right in the middle of COVID, after 14 years working in extension at Oregon State University. So I worked in the field of integrated pest management, worked with a lot of different food crop industries across the Pacific Northwest. You all found me through the Capitol Press. There was an article called Women for Ag, which they do every year. So I was featured in that, having been new in this role at Oregonians for Food and Shelter. And I think that article mentioned my Peace Corps service. So that's how you found me and got me here to talk to you. As you heard, I have a master's in applied anthropology from Oregon State. That was in 2007. At the time, they had a program with a focus area on natural resources and communities. So that was a really interesting program that took me all over Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Southern Oregon, looking at natural resource communities and really trying to understand those issues, which are very different, as we know, from, the more urban areas of our state. So in my time at Oregon State University, I worked a lot with a number of different industries, really trying to dig down on, what are your major challenges in growing your crop, and particularly managing the pests that come into your crop, and what are your needs for more research, more education, or more regulatory support in order to help, overcome those challenges and grow your crop more sustainably and more productively. So a lot of publications at OSU through extension that kind of, demonstrate just the breadth of experience I have across a number of different industries in Oregon, and a lot of knowledge about, why people struggle with pest management, what happens when, you have a pest outbreak, and what happens to the food and the food security when we have challenges managing pests. During my time at Oregon State, I also worked internationally. So this consultation method that I worked on to understand, current challenges and how to improve crop management, we took to Kenya and Malawi and worked with smallholder farmers to try to apply that method and help those people whose challenges are very different from our Oregon growers, but the method, is helpful in uncovering, what their struggles are and how their system can work together to bring more research, education, other support to these growers. So that was with a USAID project through the US government. And some of that work went into a publication that went into the Lancet Planetary Health related to pesticide risk reduction, really talking about smallholder farmers. When they get access to pesticides, it's a very different world than the way that we use pesticides in the US, and our regulatory system is much more advanced and developed than those in certain third world countries. So this is just to offer you a little bit of a flavor of, the types of work that I've done over the years and the different ways that I've tried to really serve different communities and understand needs, and then connect the dots and try to bring more support to these communities. As you heard, Oregonians for Food and Shelter since 2020. This is a trade organization that's been around in Oregon since 1980, so in its 5th decade of serving Oregon. We have members across agriculture, forestry, who are really trying to produce high quality, safe, affordable food and fiber for Oregon and also for export, using modern technology and tools that are federally available and regulated. A lot of times we see on the state level different ideas about what should be legal and allowed, and sometimes those don't quite align with our federal system and or maybe don't align with science or reason. So we engage at the legislature, we engage with regulatory agencies, and in any other context where we see threats to, production that would not really align with what we feel is scientifically credible. So how did I end up in Mongolia? I'm originally from Alabama. My parents are both from a very rural area of Alabama called Sand Mountain. My dad joined the Army when he was a teenager, just wanting to get out of there, and ended up traveling all over the world. And I guess I got some of that bug. And, as I finished my undergrad degree in Alabama, I was kind of ready to move on and see what I could do. And also at the time, somewhat of a bleeding heart. I just wanted to, be helpful and see what I could solve for people. So joining the Peace Corps was a very accessible thing to do. They kind of take care of everything once you're accepted. And so they fly you there and tell you what to do. So that's just a little bit of my background. For those of you who aren't familiar with Peace Corps, just a little bit about the mission. So Peace Corps operates in a large number of countries around the world. They were definitely impacted by COVID, and a lot of people had to go home. They've been in Mongolia since we were the 15th group in Mongolia. So I'd say early 90s was when they started. And they're really looking to provide community-based development assistance that addresses needs that the community identifies, Mongolian partners, and then cross-cultural understanding. So that's a big part of Peace Corps service in itself, is just really to have, Americans interact with people of different cultures and kind of share, cultural understanding back and forth and get to know each other and, just develop that strong relationship. So in Mongolia, the programs really emphasized community development and capacity building that can rely on locally available resources. And in any developing country, you can imagine that this is pretty challenging. You aren't given any resources through the Peace Corps. There's no money that you can work with. You're really just on the ground trying to solve problems with the community with what you have. So that makes a really interesting experience. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what I did there. So 2003 to 2005, I was stationed in Arvahir, Mongolia, which is right in the very middle of the country, kind of steppe land just above the Gobi Desert. My primary work there was as an English teacher in a school. I was also there with my now ex-husband, but husband at the time, who you see pictured here, and he was assigned to a Mercy Corps program. And for those of you who don't know, Mercy Corps is a kind of humanitarian company that's based here out of Portland. So that was a really interesting program, and I'll probably talk more about that through this presentation, just because we ended up doing a lot of work and support through that program and travel. And so that kind of just characterized my experience there a little bit more. So just a few basics about Mongolia. As you can see, north of China, south of Russia, just sandwiched there right in between. More than 3 million people, so very small population, less than 5 people per square mile. It's the most sparsely populated country in the world, with a third of the population living in rural areas. So this is a picture of, the typical house called a ger, where Mongolians live. So this is portable. They can set it up and take it down and carry it with them as they're traveling along the steppe with all of their goats and sheep and horses. Just a little bit about the religion and culture. Majority Buddhism, but there's also a lot of people who are not religious, a little bit of shamanism, Islam, Christianity, but mainly, well, actually, that's the next slide. Hold on. I'll just talk about the diet for a minute. Mongolians, although you see Mongolian food advertised, it's usually some form of Chinese food. True Mongolian food is probably not something that you would choose to eat. They eat a lot of sheep, mutton, and a lot of fat. And then they make a lot of different dairy products, from sheep, cows, camels, yaks. They make a fermented milk, which they drink at celebration times. It's like slightly alcoholic, fizzy milk, very strange. And then they also make a lot of different really hard cheeses. So hardening the cheese so that like the little babies who are teething kind of chew on this. And it's something that every kid has in their mouth at some point in time. Very few vegetables, very few fruits. Most Mongolians are not familiar with, any type of colorful vegetable or fruit and just would think that it's weird. So some of them have access to potatoes or onions, but really a lot of the Mongolians are just eating meat and dairy products that are straight from the animals that they're working with. And I was going to say, almost every Mongolian is fiercely proud of their history, really aligned with Genghis Khan, who we all know as the founder of the Mongol Empire, which became the largest empire in history. They just have immense pride in this man, despite, all of the stories that we know about him. Most Mongolians have a hanging of him in their house, and, just a lot of pride. So it's a really interesting that this is, something that they, despite all the hardship of, that they experience in their country, they're just so fiercely proud of their history and culture and background. Just a little bit about the political history of Mongolia. So since the early 1900s, Mongolia has been an independent state. They did have pretty close ties with the Soviet Union until the end of the Cold War. So a lot of the cities, which are really small, have buildings, apartment buildings and stuff that were built by the Soviets. And then in 1990, they really began to transition from a socialist state to a democracy and wanted to join the global economy. And that was a peaceful transition for Mongolia, but obviously many social challenges, economic challenges arose from that as the government and the people tried to, align themselves with the global economy, yet, identify ways within Mongolia that people could sustain themselves and make money and participate in that system. So suddenly they had a need to adapt to a new economic system, but you're really talking about around a third of the country still living a very traditional way of life. So animal herders, that's the main type of sustenance in Mongolia. People who are nomadic, who travel around with their animals. Like I said, they pack up everything, they put it on their animals' backs, horses, camels, and they travel around in search of areas where their animals can graze. So suddenly these animal herders really need more income, and they need to be able to support themselves and settle into communities. And gain knowledge of this new free market system.
Katie?
Yes.
Katie, we do have a question.
Great.
This is from Gail Myrna. How is the Mongolians' population's health affected by their diet?
I would say definitely affected. Mongolians don't tend to live anywhere near as long as Westerners. A lot of them have various ailments, and just living outdoors in extreme weather, which I'll talk about in a minute. They're definitely impacted. And that's part of what these programs were trying to do, was kind of introduce a little bit more better diet and better lifestyle.
Okay. Thank you.
a story of extremes, really. Extreme weather is just a fact of life in Mongolia. The summers are very short and can be very, very hot. The winters are incredibly long and can be really cold. So, minus 30 degrees is a normal day in the winter. So for rural households who are really raising livestock on the rangeland, they experience a lot of loss of their animals. So it's called the Zud. It's a harsh storm that contributes to drought conditions, poor forage availability, but also kills animals right then from a hard freeze. So this has been a big challenge for rural livelihood. Over 21 million livestock have been killed since 2000, based on just these cycles of extreme weather. So this is where the Mercy Corps programs really stepped in. So with a few main goals, one is to help these kind of herding communities settle and learn how to plant food for their animals, which is a totally new thing. They're used to just traveling around and looking for areas where their animals can graze. And suddenly they're being introduced to the idea of staying somewhere, planting things in the ground, and, then harvesting that to feed animals with. Also vaccinating animals, trying to keep them healthier. Weather forecasting, that was a new thing in the last 15, 20 years in Mongolia, being able to connect to the broader world and see what the weather's going to do next week. So economic development is one of the three pillars of what the Mercy Corps program was there to do. So really helping to develop, diversify, and strengthen businesses that would contribute to Mongolia's rural economy, particularly that livestock sector, which is a huge part of everyone's lives there. So learning business skills, but also offering financial services, loans, and really looking at creating markets. So setting up dairy cooperatives, setting up, groups of people working together to try to sell something, to the broader community. So that was a big program that was ultimately quite successful in helping Mongolians just learn these new skills and be able to offer something back to their communities and, use that as a livelihood. Disaster risk reduction. Mercy Corps worked with the government to really strengthen the capacity of communities to prepare for and respond to these natural disasters, mainly those harsh winter storms. So helping veterinarians and farmers to adopt disaster plans, what do you do when this happens? But also, like I said, introducing this new technology for weather information and weather predictions, so that people could gain access to that type of technology. And then the third pillar that Mercy Corps really worked on there was governance. I would say this continues to be a problem in Mongolia, just kind of corrupted government officials on every level, all the way up to the top. But Mercy Corps really partnered with government and local organizations just to try to help them implement policies that are transparent, that include rural communities in that policy making, and then working also with civil society organizations to help connect the public to the government, increase engagement, and elevate the needs of rural communities into those higher level plans for economic development and disaster preparedness, which I think was really a challenge in Mongolia. So at the highest levels, you have government officials who have more money, more power, and a little bit less regard for those people who are, suffering in those rural communities and really unable to advocate for themselves. So those are really the three main areas that Mercy Corps worked in.
And Katie,
Yes,
we've got a few more questions. Can you
sure.
take them?
Yes.
Okay, this is from DRG. How did you, an Alabaman, personally adjust to the extreme cold in Mongolia?
Yeah, so that was tough. Even in, so we lived in a kind of Soviet built apartment. And I think in the winter, the warmest we could get it in there was like in the upper 40s. So it was really cold everywhere all the time. I think you just adjust to it. You just have a lot of layers and, put on all the clothes and suddenly it becomes normal. We did have my mom and her husband come for a visit, like midway through while we were there. And it was during that time that we realized how much we had adjusted to that we assumed would be totally normal for them. So yeah, you just do it as that winter starts. But yeah, -32 freezes your eyelashes. It's
Yeah,
really cold.
yeah. Did you wear traditional clothes
Not
mostly?
every day, but we did have traditional clothes made for us. It's interesting because a lot of the Mongolians at the time that we were in community with, they think that the Western stuff is better. So they go to their market, they buy stuff from China. It's not very good quality. Meanwhile, they have, cashmere that they've grown locally that they somewhat reject because culturally they think that they want to, it's too traditional, it's too Mongolian, and they want to align more with the West and that type of fashion and influence. So that's what really got me started thinking about those, just the global impact on cultures and the global impact on rural communities and traditional communities, is just that kind of clash between what was really practical and what people rejected just based on their desire to appear more modern and
Right,
advanced.
right. I've got a question from Sheila. Did the Peace Corps program or Mercy Corps supply a Western diet for its volunteers? Like, what did you eat when you
No.
were there?
So we ate what we could get there. There was, so you end up making friends with some of the people who sell at the market. They make more trips to the capital than we were able to. It's about a 12-hour drive, kind of crammed into a little mini bus. Not a very pleasant experience to travel to the capital, but there you could get more things. So, you could get cheese, you could get vegetables. And so we would pay extra to have these market people bring us back certain things. So bring us 4 bell peppers, or bring us a little bit of Gouda cheese, and things that they would never eat or not be able to sell to anyone else there.
Mm-hmm.
But we're accessible, in the main capital city.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
So the Mercy Corps program just in the last couple of years has ended there. Mercy Corps has kind of transitioned out of Mongolia. I think a lot of successes were left in its wake. But at the same time, there's still a lot of challenges for this country. So the population of Mongolia's capital city, Ulaanbaatar, has grown by more than 70% in the last 20 years. About 40% of the whole country lives in the capital. And most of those people end up living in areas that are shown here in this slide. So no running water, no electricity, not good roads. And that area just expands bigger and bigger every year. So people just, they can't really survive in the rural areas. There's no opportunity for them there. They go to the capital. There's not really any opportunity for them there either. So they end up living in just really poor conditions. A lot of them use coal for heat, which ends up causing a lot of pollution in the air. And I've seen several articles in the last few years around the air pollution in Mongolia. I think there's some efforts by the government to help support alternative fuels for heat, but most 60% of that huge population is living in these areas with no access really to anything other than coal for heat in their stove. So you end up having skylines that look like this. This is a picture from our city when we were there. And it's really polluted, and especially on really cold winter days, it just the sky turns black. And this obviously has huge health impacts, especially to people living in more urban areas. There's a lot of health impacts based on this level of air pollution.
Katie, do they get the coal from their own country or is it imported?
That's a good question. I would say it's probably imported. I don't think they probably have some coal mining going on there. So maybe it's a mix of both. And then the other main challenge that they're dealing with is desertification. So around 41% of the country is considered desert or desert steppe, which is just, one step above desert. This is driven by both climate change and also human activities like overgrazing and now crop intensification, as people have decided to try to start planting crops. They're just really not in an area that can tolerate that. So this obviously impacts animal husbandry, air quality, living standards. Around the world, people want Mongolian cashmere. Mongolians are getting more and more goats to add to their herd, and the land just really can't sustain and feed those numbers of animals. So I would say in general, there's a lot of challenges that the country is still facing in really trying to sustain those rural communities, keep people from flocking to the cities where they're just going to end up living in these areas that are really unhealthy for them. I don't think that they've solved that yet. And, obviously, it's probably going to be a while. So just a little bit of a summary there. Some of the main challenges from my perspective are really reconciling that rural versus urban, that there's a very big difference there. The global versus local or traditional, how to balance the economy with environmental concerns. So Mongolians, want and deserve to be prosperous, to have a sustainable livelihood. But when it's at the expense of, in the environment, how do you balance those things? And then just finding sustained opportunities for traditional societies and people to live the way that they want and to live and have lived for, so many centuries in that country. It's become a huge challenge. And I'll say, just as an add-on here, in the country, alcoholism is a huge problem, particularly among men. So when we were there, they get a lot of Russian vodka, and so many men and young men, end up just consuming large amounts of alcohol. And, when they have no opportunity and they know they have no opportunity, unfortunately, that became a really big problem. And I would guess still is a really big problem in the country. So that was a pretty sad part of life. Several people that I worked with at the school had a family member who would pass away in the winter because they were drunk and they were outside and they, passed out and didn't make it through the night. And that happened way more times than you would think. And so that part of the culture was just really sad and hard to, watch without a solution for. Okay. So any more questions? You can also ask me questions at the end, but I'm gonna switch gears and talk about Oregon now.
Wonderful. This is going great, Katie. Thank you.
Okay, good. So back to Oregon in 2005. So at the time, I received a fellowship from Oregon State University called the Sustainable Rural Communities Initiative. So this was a statewide program at OSU that was really trying to address the needs and challenges of Oregon's rural towns and communities. It was one of 6 strategic initiatives at the university, and it was multidisciplinary. So there were students from forestry, public policy, and several other liberal arts majors who had come together under this fellowship. So at this time, we were seeing a lot of challenges in rural Oregon. Lots of mills closing, changes in the forestry sector. And, I just have a smattering of articles here, but you all probably remember this if you were in Oregon at the time. And I would say still probably a challenge, but there was a lot of economic downturn happening in rural parts of the state, population moving to urban areas, impacting those natural resource communities and that natural resource sector upon which a lot of these rural people depended. So I just wanted to give you a few definitions here of what it means when we're talking about rural in Oregon. So this is from the Office of Rural Health. Any geographic areas in Oregon 10 or more miles from a population center of 40,000 people or more. So those rural areas are in the lighter green color here. And other than those gray circles, it's kind of everywhere that's light green. And then frontier communities are any county with 6 or fewer people per square mile. So we have 10 of Oregon's 36 counties considered frontier communities. So these are counties that are similar to Mongolia with very, very sparse population. And I just think this is important to keep in mind. You know, those of us, I live in Portland, those of us who live in Portland, you know, we sometimes don't have a full view of what Oregon is like and just how much land there is here that is incredibly rural. And obviously that comes with economic differences. So 2019 ERS report shows that the poverty rate in rural Oregon is 13.8% compared with 11% in urban areas of the state. So that's a big difference. 12 of the top 15 highest rates of unemployment in Oregon are in rural counties. So we do see a really big difference in Oregon between our urban areas and our rural areas. And a lot of times, and certainly in the last few years, those differences aren't well expressed in with decision makers and policymakers who don't have connections to those rural areas and really, you know, lack understanding of what it's like. So state policies can have both positive and negative impacts to rural Oregon. On the positive side, we worked on a bill just this last session where Oregon's rural and frontier communities are now included as environmental justice communities in recent legislation. So that was an add-on that wasn't in the original bill, but that was done, you know, through consultation with people representing these rural areas. You know, when we're talking about environmental justice in areas that have been somewhat left behind, we can't forget about Oregon's rural areas and frontier communities. Those are, you know, really important parts of that conversation. Yet, on the other hand, many policies that end up getting passed by what we have now in our legislature, which is a supermajority of Democratic legislators, do end up having significant impacts to rural Oregon, particularly when we're talking about natural resource industries. You know, a lot of these legislators from urban areas are just disconnected from agriculture, from forestry, from rural areas, and it's really difficult to try to bridge that divide because there's so much polarization, as you all know. So I'm just going to give you a couple of stats about ag and forestry in Oregon. So I love this graph, Oregon total land area. We've got almost 47% forest land in Oregon. Around 50% is non-forest. So that's going to include any agriculture, urban areas, rangeland, and then a tiny bit of water. And so of that forest land, around 30% is privately managed. The Oregon forest sector contributes over 60,000 jobs, $18 billion industry. Oregon is #1 for softwood lumber, plywood, and engineered wood production. And then just a little note here, substituting wood for other building materials really reduces emissions by a hugely significant amount. So wood is good, as they say. Oregon ag stats, you all probably are familiar with this. We have a huge agriculture industry in the state. Agriculture makes up 13% of the state's gross product. We're a specialty crop state, so rather than like some states growing mainly corn or soy, we have over 220 recognized commodities. So a lot of variety in our ag sector, a lot of different crops grown here. This graphic here shows you kind of the top 20. $5 billion industry, more than 37,000 farms and ranches, and more than 96% of those are family owned and operated. So a really interesting sector here between ag and forestry, that natural resource sector. I just would love to have, you know, more urban people learn more about that and make more connections with, you know, those areas and industries. Let's see, I put these in the wrong order, so I'm going to go here first. So, you know, this is an election year. I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's a lot happening in politics in Oregon right now. The Capitol Chronicle is a relatively new journalism outlet, nonprofit, and based on really looking at government and politics. They put together a series of listening sessions, asking, you know, what people want and what people think from rural Oregon. How do we help build and sustain rural areas of the state? So they worked with rural development initiatives and a journalism center from the University of Oregon. And really, this is what came out of that. People are pretty dissatisfied right now across the board with where Oregon, is headed. What did the rural communities say they wanted? Opportunity, a way to make a living. This is kind of number one basic. People in rural areas want to stay in those rural areas. They want to continue living. Many of the people that I represent and work with are fifth, sixth generation farmers or ranchers. They want to be able to continue doing that sustainably. Adaptability, so policies that are not one size fits all. A policy that might fit in Portland will not fit in Malheur County. Participation, ability to contribute meaningfully to problem solving and co-develop policies, and engagement from urban decision makers. So these were the kind of top things that came out of that Capitol Chronicle listening session. This is what people from urban area or rural areas want for themselves to help improve their livelihoods. So how does this play out in politics? We have an open governor's race this year, as you all probably know, almost 40 candidates, so around 20 on either side. It's crazy. How can you possibly do your research and find out which candidates to support with that many people? We have a changed map due to redistricting last year. So we've got some new congressional districts and also some new state districts. We're going to have more than 25% turnover in the state legislature this year, and that's on top of around 10% last year. So our legislature is going to have, almost 40% new faces starting with 2023 session. And then our natural resource industries have suffered hugely over the last few years between COVID-19 and the series of disasters that you all are aware of: fires, drought, ice, snow. These have brought both federal and state disaster relief money to our farms and ranches, but I can say not quickly enough, and really not enough. So I think in the next few years, we're probably going to see, more losses of our own, state natural resource sector, and people who really just can't make it. So, I just repeating this slide, I think the challenges are similar. We're looking at reconciling rural and urban in Oregon, those global forces that impact local communities. How do we reconcile those things? And that's not an answer I have. Same with economy and environment. We have to be able to sustain our rural communities. Those people have to make a living. Often those depend on agriculture or forestry. How do we balance that with environmental concerns? How do we sustain opportunities for rural communities? So, the themes are similar. The challenges is similar. I don't really have the solutions, but I'll, make an effort with this slide. It's really critical to find ways to uplift rural voices, to sustain those rural communities, both here and abroad. Rural people have to be involved. They have to co-write policy. It can't be written by Democrat urban legislators and then applied to rural areas. It just doesn't work. And it contributes and just worsens that divide and people feeling like they don't have a say in, their own lives. So what we try to do a lot is just education. Urban Democratic legislators tend to be disconnected from agriculture and forestry. And we just try to get out there and educate them on, what does the industry look like? What happens when you make changes? What would be the impact of this proposed decision? How can we, what ideas do we have to insert into that to maybe lessen the blow to some of these communities or some of these industries while still balancing the concerns that are there for the environment or, other concerns. So that's what I've got for you. This is the staff at OFS. We're a small but mighty team of 3 women. Myself, we have a grassroots coordinator who really works at the county level in certain counties of Oregon, trying to get allied natural resource professionals meeting together, knowing each other, helping to educate their local officials, county commissioners, city council, doing tours, getting people out onto dairy farms, helping people understand what that sector looks like. and then Diane Washburn, our office manager. So there's my email address and my phone number. Happy to take any questions that you guys have about everything I just told you.
Oh, Katie, I had no idea that this was going on in Oregon. I mean, I had an idea. I suppose I should say I had an idea, but that the work is this important work you're doing. Did you co-found this organization?
No, I did not. So this organization started, like I said, in 1980.
That's
I
right.
was just a wee little toddling baby at that time, but so yeah, in its fifth decade, it's been around a long time. You know, over the years, it's taken many forms, and you know, I've only been there a year and a half, so we'll
Would
see where it goes with me. But you know, taking all of my history and experience, I really want to use this opportunity to just, yeah, use this organization to help.
what?
So I see a question there. Who
Yes,
funds
here we
the
go.
organization?
Let's see here. Hank Robb has a question. Who funds your organization? How do you get your funds?
So it's funded by our members.
Mhm.
So we have, like I said, members across agriculture and forestry, small and large operations, individuals, businesses. It's 100% funded by our members.
Remember, would you say a major part of your role is lobbying legislatures,
Yeah.
local communities plus state? Uh,
Yes, so we have a contract lobbyist who also represents Oregon dairy farmers, Oregon cattlemen. So he has a lot of natural resource experience. And yeah, so for the last year and a half, I've been a registered lobbyist for the first time. And, you know, I haven't stepped into the Capitol yet in my new role because it was
mhm,
closed for both of the
right.
last sessions. But yeah, I think I won't be the main lobbyist, but because I'll be, you know, interacting with
Mhm.
legislators, really trying to get that education there. That's what I have to do.
Well, the questions are coming in. Dave DiNucci has a question. He's going to come in live. Hang in there, Dave. Come on in, Dave. There he
Um,
is.
yep. So two questions. One is like when it comes to infrastructure type things, one would imagine that a lot of the demands, a lot of the bills that are passed and stuff affect the urban people much more than the suburban. I mean, more than farmland and those areas. So is there just kind of a natural divide there between the different constituents and where they see their money going and causing rifts there? And the second part is your name basically gives an idea that you might have a focus on homelessness and things like that, food
Yeah.
and shelter. Do you get that confusion? And do you have some thoughts on that whole thing?
Yeah. So I'll answer your second one first because
Okay.
yes, constantly people are confused. I think in 1980, that was people's way of being slightly cheeky. You know, people need food, people need shelter. That's what the forest and ag industries are providing. So Oregonians for food and shelter, constantly getting people confused. And yes, I would love to kind of visit with my board, like the idea of having a less confusing name that better reflects, you know, growing Oregon, something that's like really shows that what we're trying to work on.
Okay.
Your first question about infrastructure is an interesting one. I probably don't have the best answer for it, but you know, in a nutshell, yes, there is, you know, there's a huge rift between um, rural and urban, and the resources that go to urban areas versus those that go to rural areas. And I can tell you that you know, a lot of the policies, you know, it's not just about resources, because a lot of the policies that have been passed over the last few years, from the rural perspective, really feel like, you know, they're the target. They're
Hmm.
you know, the purpose is to kind of have them be doing something different. But there's very little consultation or, you know, listening or sitting down together. And you know, the way I see the legislature, and I'm a newbie in the policy space in Oregon, but you know, the Democrats don't like to talk to the Republicans and vice versa. I mean, there's some that are kind of in the middle that can work together, but in general, there's a lot of party line votes, especially when it comes to like environmental issues or natural resource, forestry issues. These are hot button issues, pesticides. I work on like the worst issues to have to try to engage and be friendly about, because these become very emotional issues, but actually they have a lot of science behind them. And so that's what we like to try to convey to the legislators. But it is really hard because the rural communities feel that the urban Democrats are calling all the shots, and they don't need the Republicans right now. They don't need anyone from rural areas right now. So it's a courtesy to reach out and try to get some feedback about a bill, but they don't have to do that because they don't need any votes. So it's an interesting place to be in, and you can see a lot of ways that it could all be improved if only people would be willing to listen and learn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a comment from Sheila Pistori. Katie, are you interested in running for public office? I think you would be an asset to the Oregon legislature.
That's funny.
A high compliment. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm cut
go
out for that, but
might think about it.
Yeah.
Very good. Mike Boucher, you have a question from Friendly House. Bring it, come on in.
Yeah, am I on? Yeah. Okay.
You sure are.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of, shall we say, predatory commentators who exploit these ill feelings, especially in rural areas, which it's not just that they're addressing concerns, but they're also feeding more anger for their own political agenda. And I think that's something the Democrats should be aware of if they're getting too neglectful of the rural areas.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I feel like that happens to some extent on both sides. People, we have our perceptions of what, if you're rural, you have your perception of urban. If you're urban, you have your perception of rural. And almost always that's really not the reality. But we don't have a lot of access to each other, and there aren't a lot of spaces for us to interact and learn from each other. And that's a real challenge, even in, our state government, even in our regulatory agencies. There's not a lot of opportunity to really bring people together from various perspectives and have like a really true, open sharing. And that would solve a lot of this misperception and, misinformation if we could just get people talking together more and, listening and learning from each other.
In other words, maybe have more people from Portland visiting out in the rural areas, just on their vacations, kind of engaging with the local populations there.
Yeah, definitely.
Katie, do you work at all with school groups? It's kids need to get outside. They need to see the rural experience. And I'm just curious, does your organization work with schools at all or with children?
We don't personally, but there are organizations in the ag sector. AgLink is one of them. They do ag in the classroom. I think they do ag in the classroom, or Adopt a Farmer. There's a few different organizations. I think I just said that wrong. But yeah, so we support different organizations who really have a focus of so Adopt a Farmer works in a lot of urban areas, trying to get middle school classes adopted with a local farm. And then they take trips out to that farm and they see the farm and they, learn about what farming is like and what risks farmers have to take and why, it's not so simple as just putting something in the ground and watching it grow. So yeah, there are some really great programs in Oregon that have that as their goal.
I think Oregon does a pretty good job with their outdoor school for sixth graders to get them connected to the forest or to wilderness. And with the goal is, if you care about it, you're going to want to have legislation passed to protect these areas. And but but the farming is different, and so that's wonderful that they have that.
Yeah.
We have a question from Joyce Lackey. Some of us are interested in the rural organizing project. Perhaps we could set up some urban-rural meetings through that resource.
Yeah. I
Joyce,
don't
you may have
think
to
I've
come.
heard
Yeah,
that.
here's Joyce. Yeah, Joyce, talk a little bit about that if you would, please.
Well, I think it was my Crossing Party Lines group that found out about them, and we had a speaker, I believe, once in a very small group. But that group, that it's calling themselves the Rural Organizing Project, has come up with just a one, I mean, such a comprehensive plan for what needs to be done for economic development, education. Um, and I don't know that we've ever reached out to them and tried to set up some dialogues, but maybe something like our Indivisible, or Indivisible is definitely political though. That's definitely on the left. Maybe we could
Mhm.
find some way to set up, I don't know, chambers of commerce or through someone like that to reach out and have some dialogue. Are you
Yeah.
Especially
familiar with
with
that project?
Zoom, it's possible.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll try to think of a few suggestions for you too. Maybe invite a farmer to come and talk to your group and talk more kind of higher level about policy issues that impact agriculture. And I could even think of like a few representatives that represent rural areas. It might be, I don't know if they'd be willing to do it, but it might be interesting to extend the invitation just to hear from a representative from the east side on
Right.
what issues they're dealing with and how it's different from the issues that we think about in Portland.
That would be wonderful,
Maybe we
Katie.
should try to
Mhm.
bring a speaker from that project to just lay out
Yeah.
what a broad, comprehensive plan that it is.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, Joyce, you have Katie's contact information, so you could send her that information. It'd be
Mhm.
wonderful. Katie, I have a simple question. You talked about folks getting text messages in Mongolia to be warned about climate. If there's no electricity, how do they have cell phones?
I think cell phones weren't a thing when I was there. Um,
Sure.
I think that a lot of them have, well, through that project, I think it was solar. And
Oh,
then,
solar, of
a
course.
lot of them have now like settled in areas where they can get electricity. Usually, I'm guessing, yeah, solar.
They
Um,
can get. Mhm.
yeah, phones really came in, 5 years or so, or even three
Right,
after we were there. And
right,
then suddenly
right,
everyone had a phone.
right, without having to have phone wires.
Yeah.
Kathy Moyd has a question. Kathy, come on in.
I thought I had put it in the chat, but I discovered I hadn't registered. So
No, here you
yeah, I
go.
have a couple of things. One is in term, I've been advocating for legislation for the League of Women Voters, primarily on climate change. And I've tried to get more educated about the rural urban divide. It seems like, I think, I have no idea what his religious bent is, but I think Findlay tends to be one of the ones who seems to be more willing to work on. Is that a
Yeah, I was thinking actually Mark Owens. Do you
he
know
was my
Mark
he was my
Owens?
he's my other one. I think both of those have been on the Natural Resources Committee, which is what I spent most of my time with.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, in the last legislature, there were a couple bills. The Forestry Accord, did you support that?
So my organization was neutral on that because we actually have, among even my board members, we have some large timber companies that were at the table to that MOU process who really wanted that legislation to pass. And then we have other organizations who were in opposition to that, who weren't at the table and, have a little bit less connection and ownership of that. So that was actually tricky for us. And so we just decided to stay neutral on that.
Okay, and I guess the other one was the Natural and Working Lands bill that didn't make it out.
Yeah. And so that bill is a good example of a bill that was really put forward by non-rural, non-natural resource industry
Okay.
folks, and really did not get a lot of consultation through that,
Okay,
in
I'd like,
writing that policy around working lands. It would have been super helpful to include ag forestry people who represent, people who are from working lands.
yeah, okay, I would like, yeah, I'll contact you afterwards to try to get us more. I wasn't involved in that one. I've been more on the renewable energy side.
Yeah.
But I've tried to get educated on it, but our group did support that bill. So I need
sure.
to find out, since it didn't pass, there may be some things that we want to encourage them to. And the league seems to be treated as an organization that's not so far left that shouldn't be listened to. So
Right.
so
Yeah, I think just trying to make some relationships with some of the ag organizations would be really helpful. And then, you know, using those relationships to develop the
Yeah.
policy.
yeah. And so I think that's it. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, it's a great connection. Kathy, do you have Katie's contact information?
She's sending out her slides, right?
Oh, thanks,
And
Katie.
then it looks like
very
you have a
much
question
appreciated.
from Renee has been trying to ask a question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Go ahead, Renee.
So, yeah, Renee and I are married 65 years. That's the Renee.
Oh, okay.
I'm Jules
didn't think
Elias,
so.
and
That's right.
I really appreciate your even-tempered look at acute problems that come down to, if you take it to its end point, it's our survival. It's not a question of more money in the bank or whatever else comes with that accolade. It's so crucial that we pay attention. And I'm alluding to your Mongolian experience is a microcosm of what is happening in the world. So you get these people who are traveling to the next farmland or grazing land to sit still, and you give them seeds and you convince them that that would be a better way. And then drought comes in to tell them, you know, it's not going to be necessarily as easy as you would think it is. And the layers are that, and then the people who go to the Capitol is analogous to our homeless. Here, they go there because they have nowhere else to go. Nobody cares about them, and they're going to land wherever they land. So why? I'm sort of venting, but the 800-pound gorilla in a closet is climate change. You know, it's there, whether it's urban, suburban, it doesn't matter. Potable water, adequate food, clean air, land that's still able to give us food. I mean, basic. It couldn't be more basic. And yet we still get lost in the small stuff, which in an individual's life is not small, I agree. So how do you cope with the big picture and the reality of what people are telling you on a one-to-one basis? How do you cope with it?
That's an interesting question. How do I cope with it? You know, I feel like I'm working at all of those levels. So, you know, we just had a meeting last week with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They're trying to get a huge grant that would, you know, give funding to our ag sector for more climate smart practices, you know, in agriculture.
Right.
We need solutions for our ag industry. You know, they're going to have to, in some cases, transition to different crops, you know, learn how to adapt to new pests. There's a lot of tools there. You know, we don't like pesticides, but in many cases, that's going to be the answer to climate change and new pests that come into new crops. So we, on that broader scale, you know, we are working for and asking for a focus on that and solutions for our ag sector, you know, down at that kind of individual scale. You know, we have to be there too. And that's really my job, is to listen to my members and those individual policies that may or may not connect up to those bigger problems. You know, we have to deal with those too. I think, you know, it would be great if we could get all of our legislators aligned on those bigger challenges, and then, you know, really coming up with solutions to those challenges that bring everyone along at once. It may not be the solution that you want on the left. It may not be the solution that people want on the right, but there is one in there that, you know, everyone could agree on. And those are the kind of policies that we're going to need in order to get people, you know, those people growing our food have to be on board if we want them to make changes and be able to adapt.
Thank you so much, Katie. And one final comment: the farmers markets, there's one in Mongolia, they're so well attended.
Yes.
People just love buying locally grown produce. and the farmers are able to make some money out of it and whatever. It's, again, a small idea of how people-to-people interactions work. You don't need, an oversight in every sense. But I don't, okay, I'm going to back off. But thank you again for doing this. And again, I always thank the humanists for reaching out to people like you who give us information that we should be apprised of. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. We've got a question from the Friendly House. Dave Gray, come on in.
Yeah, there is a small but growing movement to emphasize the eating vegetables and fruit and minimize consumption of meat and dairy for environmental and personal health. And I'm wondering if that has caused a decrease in demand for dairy and in Oregon, and therefore has it affected the dairy cattle industry and the beef industry in Oregon?
Interesting question. I don't think that we've seen an impact in demand, and I actually a lot of our product produced in Oregon is exported to either other states or other countries. So that demand is really strong and continues to be strong. I think the challenge is, the more state level regulations we impose on these industries, even in some cases, we've seen ballot measures that would, attempt to make it illegal to kill an animal before the end of its natural life, for example. The more things that we impose at a state level, the more food we get from elsewhere where, it's not grown here in Oregon. It's not grown in a way that we would maybe want it to be grown. So I think, there needs to be a balance with how we at the state level move forward and moving beyond those federal regulations. If we want to create a system here, it has to work and it has to be sustainable for our producers. Otherwise, we lose that production and then, it comes from somewhere else.
Right. We have another question from Friendly House. Leslie, can you come in, please?
There's so much to cover, I don't know where to start. But the following up on what Dave just talked about, there's a concept of degrowth. And I knew from the beginning that there are too few vegans or vegetarians in the country, and it's going to stay that way a long time. So you're not going to see an impact in the market. But the problem is that we've got the concept of degrowth is out there. And degrowth goes along with the idea of a sustainable markets and whatever. And I'm kind of curious what happened, why we left Mongolia. And secondly, I'm curious, you mentioned cooperatives there, and I'm curious whether whether the U.S. had something to do with, because back in the 90s, of course, we were trying to push Russia out of every place anyway, whether that had some reason why going to a more capitalist system might have hurt the Mongolians more than being in the socialist system or some sort of a cooperative system. But anyway, the Center for the Advancement of Sustained growth is a concept that we all have to get more in line with. And if the cattlemen in Eastern Oregon could possibly degrow a little bit and maybe grow a few less cattle, maybe Bureau of Land Management might be able to catch up to them in managing their lands.
So I'll try to answer some of that. I mentioned that Mercy Corps has transitioned out of Mongolia. The Peace Corps is still there. I think there's a lot of other US-based aid organizations still operating there, probably Save the Children, who was there when I was there. So, I think your other question was around the development of cooperatives. Obviously, there was a big transition when Mongolia went from a more Soviet-style economy to a democracy, and then suddenly participating in the capitalist system of the world. And that has a huge impact. So trying to build people together into cooperatives and working together and relying on each other was really, using what was available in those communities and the resources that are available, which are each other, was the solution to that, and really helping them, work together to sustain themselves. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but and I don't know much about the concept of degrowth. I think the one thing I would say to that is, you all know this, in the world, our population is exploding. We're going to need a heck of a lot more food to feed this growing population. Some of us in urban areas make choices about the food that we eat. A lot of people in the world don't have that luxury, don't have that opportunity. So they eat what they eat, and it might be cows, it might be whatever it is. But across all scales, across all crops, and using all production methods, we need strategies to increase yields, decrease what's lost to pests and pest pressures, and to adapt to climate change, which is going to have a huge impact on how we're able to grow food.
Katie, thank you. The one insight I'm really taking away from this today is the idea of social justice includes all people. That all people need a spot at the table to be heard and what they're experiencing. So I can't thank you enough for the presentation. You really mix the Mongolian experience with what you're doing with in Oregon today. Truly appreciate it. You put a lot of time and effort into this, and I truly appreciate all that you did. It was great. You really did a good job.
Thank you so much. I was nervous that I was going to be telling you something interesting. So I really appreciate the invitation. I'm going to follow up with, I'll try to think of some suggestions, people you could ask to come and talk to your group.